So today's lecture will be a continuation of our discussion on process synchronization. In the last class, we introduced the concept of synchronization of processes, and we saw that the IPC mechanisms where processes communicate among themselves eventually has some shortcomings, some drawbacks. And if you don't care about these problems, then you may end up into a peculiar situation where after the processes have interacted, we are not able to identify the final result. So because processes or threads, they share data among themselves, data or data structure, and since the scheduling of these processes, the context switching that happens is decided by the scheduler. Now, there is every possibility that these processes or threads can run in any order. And that eventually gives rise to a problem called race condition, where the final outcome is unknown. Now, if that happens with a shared data or data structure, it's very difficult to work. So the idea is to avoid race condition. And the mechanism that we devised to avoid race condition is to protect that particular region of the code in such a way that only one process or one thread will be allowed to execute that shared part at a time. Only one process or only one thread would be executing or will be using that shared data or data structure. So the portion of the code that should be guarded is what we call critical section. It may be a table, it may be a variable, it may be any other data. So we are not interested to know what kind of a data it is. It is just important to consider that this is a shared data or a data structure, and that has to be protected. Protected in a sense that whenever multiple processes want to access that particular data structure, that data or data structure, which we often call critical section, will only be allowed to be accessed by one process or thread. This mechanism is called mutual exclusion. We saw different algorithms, different software-based techniques to ensure mutual exclusion. But in addition to mutual exclusion, there are two more properties that a particular algorithm should look after. And they are called the progress requirement. Progress requirement means if you allow one particular process to enter critical section, or let's say if no other processes are currently in the critical section, and one of those processes wish to enter critical section, that process should be immediately allowed. No other process which wishes to enter critical section should not prevent the process requesting to enter the critical section. This is what we call the progress requirement. That is, the progress of a particular process should not be hampered by any other process which is not participating in the decision making of entering the critical section. Or in other words, processes which do not take part in decision of who enters the critical section should not prevent those who wish to enter. And third is, any algorithm that you devise should be fair. You should give every process a chance once to enter critical section. You should not be biased towards any one particular algorithm. We saw four different algorithms. We saw the different drawbacks in the first three. And finally, we ended up into the acceptable solution, which was provided by Peterson's, and we call that Peterson's solution, which was how by use of three shared variables, we could ensure that all the three requirements are met. And finally, so once we could devise a solution for a two-process mutual exclusion problem, we finally extended that to understand how do we ensure mutual exclusion for an n process problem? That is, if you have an n process which wish to enter critical section, how do you decide on that? And that was provided by Leslie Lamport in his famous paper, which he called the bakery algorithm. And the bakery algorithm was a very simple assumption that every process will be given a number. The process with the least number would be allowed to enter the critical section. In no point of time, two processes would get the same number. That will be ensured by an atomic relation. Atomic relation means a particular process, if an instruction is executing, it cannot be interrupted in between. This was the idea that we have seen so far. So with this, today we are going to talk about, first of all, the hardware support for mutual exclusion. How can the processes make use of hardware to ensure mutual exclusion? Then we'll talk about two different kind of locking techniques. One is called the spin lock. The second is called mutex. We will see the shortcomings of both of them, the limitations where they cannot be used. And we will remove that by introducing a concept called semaphore. This is the idea that was again proposed by Dijkstra, and he proposed a variable to be used in such a way that that would ensure both locking as well as maintenance of which of the processes are currently sleeping. We'll talk about that later on. So today we'll be covering this part, and finally we'll see the bounded buffer problem, or the producer-consumer problem, with the constraint that producer and consumer will be interacting through a bounded buffer. We'll try to solve that problem, the synchronization of producer and consumer, through semaphores. That is the agenda for today. And tomorrow we'll take up the other three classical problems, some more of that. Finally, a programming language construct, which is used to perform synchronization, which is called monitors. So let us begin today with discussion on the hardware support. Okay, so for all those who were there in the last class, you may recall that the way in which we ensure mutual exclusion, the idea of protecting the critical section, is through ensuring mutual exclusion. What is mutual exclusion? The idea is that every process, for the critical section of every process, will be guarded by a lock section and an unlock section. In some books, they call it the entry section and the exit section. Entry section of the particular process is okay. So in many books, you may find that they call it the entry section and exit section, or you can call it the lock section and unlock section. Here we have the example of a process which is where the critical section is guarded by a lock. Now let's look at a two process problem where we have process 1 and process 2, and both of them, they want to enter critical section. So the simplest solution would be that let's introduce something called a lock, and we'll initialize the lock with some value. Okay, let's say lock equal to 1 to start off with. And if you are process number 1, you enter this entry section. So when the process 1 code gets executed and this entry section is executed, the first statement or the first instruction that gets executed is this check, which is this while loop. And you find that lock is not equal to 0 because lock is 1. And if lock is 1, automatically you fall through this. That means you start executing this instruction. Okay, so Right. So what you do is you look at the value of lock. If lock is not equal to 0, okay, sorry. So we initialize with lock equal to 0. Okay. You check this while loop. You find if lock not equal to 0, you loop. So what does it mean? That if lock is not equal to 0, you loop. That means you do no operation. You keep on looping. But if, because we initialized lock with 0 and you entered this loop with lock equal to 0, you fall through this and you enter to execute this section. So the next instruction that gets executed is lock equal to 1 and process 1 enters critical section. Because process 1 has made the lock equal to 1, process 2 during that time, if it wants to enter the critical section, will execute its own entry and exit section and will start executing that. So let us assume that after the process 1 has entered critical section, process 2 wants to enter critical section. Okay, so suppose the scheduler has now allowed process 2 to proceed. Process 2 will check this line and will find lock not equal to 0 because process 1 has made lock equal to 1. So as long as lock remains at 1, process 2 will keep on looping. Okay, process 2 will keep on looping in this line. So in a sense, process 2 is prevented from entering critical section. I hope this is okay. All of you?
Yes, sir.
Question is, does it provide mutual exclusion? What is the answer?
No, sir. No, sir.
Why?
Sir, मतलब जैसे while lock not equal to 0 in the process one execute, and if there may be the context switch, then the under the process 2, and that while lock not that condition also true, and the both lock will become 1 and both start executing the critical section.
Correct. Let's see the situation. Okay. So this is the situation that Mantraj was talking about. So what he said is that let's consider this part. The blue lines are the ones which are executed by the process 1 and the green ones are the instructions that are executed by process 2. And these dotted lines that you see are the context switch. That is, the scheduler starts executing the other process and puts the currently running process in the ready queue. So let us assume that you started off with lock equal to 0 and assume that the scheduler has first allowed process 1 to proceed. So process 1 starts the execution, executes this line. Okay, that is, it checks whether the lock is not equal to 0, but finds that the lock is equal to 0. So remember, the lock has been read here. The lock variable has been read. So the value of the lock is currently known to process P1, but suddenly there is a context switch. That means the process 1's execution is stopped and process 2 begins. Process 2 also begins with this line, and process 2 also reads the lock variable. So the lock variable is read by process 2 as well. Okay, but none of them have updated the lock. So the initial value of lock, that is equal to 0, is read by both P1 and P2. But interestingly, there's no context switch, and let's say P2, which is lock equal to 1. Okay, this has been made. So P2 goes through the next instruction and makes or updates lock with value equal to 1. Okay, with value lock equal to 1. And suddenly there is again a context switch, and you go back to process P1, and process P1 proceeds with the next instruction, which is updation of the lock. And here you see that the lock gets updated. Now that the lock gets updated and both of process P1 and P2 see lock equal to 1, which means next time when both of them will try to execute this line, both will see lock equal to 1 and both of them will enter the critical section. right? Or let's say the lock equal to 1, with both lock equal to 1, they will enter the critical section. So this is the problem that we have with this situation. We try to ensure mutual exclusion, we cannot, because the context switching happens and may lead to disturbance in the order in which the instruction should be executed. So what is the solution? What is the solution to this problem? Where is the problem? The problem is things are getting into trouble because you are allowing context switching to happen. Before this, so if this line and this line would have been executed and then these two lines would have been executed, the problem would not happen. But because you allowed context switching in between the execution of these two lines of P1, that is what created the problem. So what is to be done? The easiest solution is prevent execution of other instructions until a certain instruction is over. And this is called the concept of atomicity. As you see here, the whole problem lied because these two instructions of P1 could not be completed. Context switching happened in between them. So the requirement is that this instruction has to be atomic. Atomic means the instruction will be able to execute without being interrupted. You will not allow any kind of context switching until they get executed. Had that been there, then this problem would not have occurred. Because P1 would have made lock equal to 1, and when then P2 would have read the value of lock, it would have found that lock equal to 1. This is the problem. So how can you make instructions atomic? We can make instructions atomic by making use of or by taking help of hardware. So you need hardware to handle this problem. How? Well, there is this solution. So the solution is that with some support from hardware, the critical section problem can be solved simply and effectively. Okay, where obviously in a uniprocessor environment. Uniprocessor means there is only one processor, but many processors. Okay, what is the solution? The solution is you disable interrupts. You know that a CPU, suppose this is the CPU, is currently running a process P1. So this is currently being executed by the CPU. You don't want anything to execute of P2. So what you will do, when will this scheduling happen? The scheduling will happen if CPU is interrupted and told that stop P1 and go for P2. So if you cut this line logically, not physically, that means you don't allow interrupts to come. Obviously, the process will not be interrupted. So what you do is you disable interrupts. That is, you do not allow any interrupt to come. When not throughout the entire process, but during execution of the critical section. So when P1 is currently running in the critical section, keep in mind that you have to disable interrupts so that no other process can disturb during the time when P1 was working with the critical section. But there is a problem. The problem is you cannot do it in this way. Okay, maybe you can do it in a uniprocessor system, but in a multiprocessor system, this does not work out. Okay, so this disabling interrupt is not a good solution. It's a very time-consuming process because you have to disable the interrupt. Then once the critical section is over, you have to enable that and always keep track of that. Okay, I'm going to enter critical section, so it is time for me to disable interrupts. So that is the first problem. It's a time-consuming process. Okay, and it is not a good solution. Second is the system efficiency decreases. If you go on repeatedly doing enabling and disabling of interrupts, you actually prevent other important things also from working. So this is not a proper solution, and definitely not for a multi-processor environment. So what is the solution then? The solution is that don't rely on interrupt. Rather, you introduce certain special instructions which will be executed atomically. This is the solution. Okay, you introduce special kind of instructions which will be executed atomically. That is, these instructions, when are executed, cannot be interrupted. What do you mean by that? Let me show you. The idea is this, that if I am working on a particular instruction, what is the idea behind designing such an instruction? The instruction will be such that it will be writing to a memory location and will return its old value. This is the operation that this instruction will do. It will write to a memory location and will return its old value. So that means there will be a reading operation first, where the previous value is read. And so the value that is currently in the memory, suppose this is the memory locations, the instruction would be that I will read this, and this is what I will return, and I will update that. So I will perform a write. That's the idea. You write to a memory location and you return its old value. Return means you read the old value and provide it. This is the instruction. Okay. And this to read and write has to be atomic. That means the read followed by write, both read and write will happen, and then you can allow any other instruction to proceed. Both read and write have to be completed. That's the idea. Okay, as you see here. So we call this instruction as test and set. Why test? Because you are reading that, you are testing whether it is according to the value that is you expect. And set means you are writing to a new value. Test and set. So let us say we are reading a particular value of a particular memory location called W, and the instruction would be such that you can write the instruction in the form of a procedure or a function. Let's like test and set, pass an argument W. What does this instruction do? It reads W, puts it into a temporary variable called previous, updates W by 1, and returns previous. So the previous value of W is, or the original value of W is returned, and W is set to 1. That is what you do. This is the end. Okay. So let us say the variable is called V. Let us initialize V to be equal to 0. So test and set V means if I apply test and set, and how are you going to use this test and set? Let me show you. So if there's a process called PI, the PI will initially, so let's say this is P1, the P1 V equal to 0. So you have test and set, you pass the value of V. So what will happen? Because V is 0, V is 0, P1 will enter this with execution of test and set. And what does test and set do? Test and set returns the previous value, that is V equal to 0. The previous value of V is 0. So the return value of test and set is 0. And what is the next operation that test and set will do? It will update V by 1. So if you run test and set once, you have ensured that the return value of V is 0 and V has been set to 1. Okay, this is what you do. Now let's see how I can utilize this test and set to ensure mutual exclusion. The question is, does it perform mutual exclusion? Answer is yes. Does it give us freedom from deadlock? Yes, that means it allows progress required. Is it starvation free? Starvation means if a particular process, will it so happen that we'll never get a chance to go into the critical section? Maybe, I don't know. For the time being, let's put it as no. Let's see that. So is the instruction clear to everyone? What is the instruction supposed to do? If you write test and set and pass any variable is nothing but a memory location. It reads the original value and updates it with the new value. Okay. Priya, what exactly is the question? Can you just tell me? I am not able to understand this concept of hardware support. Can you please repeat it once? Oh, sure. As you just saw, a basic requirement of mutual exclusion using locks is to ensure that whenever a lock is read, that is, you are working something with the lock variable, you have to make that lock variable reading process and updation process of the lock an atomic operation. Is that clear? We just saw in the previous example when there was a problem in reading the lock, because the reading of the lock in the while loop and updation was interrupted. So the requirement is that these two instructions, reading of the lock variable and updation of the lock variable before you enter critical section, should be atomic. One way to do an atomic operation is to introduce a new kind of instruction, which will ensure that these two operations, reading the lock and updating the lock, is an atomic instruction. And for that reason, we introduce an instruction called test and set. The functionality of the test and set instruction is such that if you provide an argument to test and set instruction, the test and set instruction will read the previous value of that argument, that is the current value of the argument, and will update it with a new value. So if the current value of the argument V is 0 and the new value is 1, if you run test and set on V, it will read 0 and will update 1. This is what test and set will do. Is that clear? The question is, how can we make use of this test and set to ensure mutual exclusion? We are going to see this now. Let's see. This is the way in which we are going to perform mutual exclusion through test and set. On the left hand side is the functionality or the definition of the test and set. Test and set instruction takes as an input a lock. Okay, we are passing the lock variable as a pointer because we told that's a memory location. So we are passing the address of that particular location. And what does it return? It returns int. Yes, because it can. What does it return? It returns the previous value or the original value or the current value of the particular variable lock. So it returns int. What is the definition? The definition says that whatever lock variable you have, that is what you put into the previous. It's a temporary variable, and you return previous. But before that, you update L. On the right hand side is a process that makes use of test and set instruction to ensure mutual exclusion. Look at how the process utilizes this instruction. What has it done? It has used this while loop. Now let's consider the situation of two processes, P1 and P2. Let us assume that P1 is executing this loop. P2 has also the same code. So both P1 and P2 have the same code. So let's say P1 is executing first. What will happen? P1 will enter this particular line and will execute this while loop. The while loop is nothing but reading of this or execution of this test and set instruction. What have you passed to test and set? The value of lock. And let us assume that lock was initially equal to 0. Okay. Let's assume the current value of lock is 0. So what have you done? If you pass lock to test and set, what will this instruction do? What will test and set return? What will test and set return? What will this line, what will be the return value of this particular line for P1? Please tell me.
Previous value of the lock.
What is that?
0.
0. Absolutely 0. So this will be 0. So now just check the while condition. it is not equal to 1 because the return value of test and set lock is not equal to 1. It will fall through this while loop and will fall into this line. So P1 starts executing the critical section. And remember, there cannot be any context switch because test and set is an atomic instruction. During the time, let's see the situation of P2. Suppose this test and set operation is over. P1 has entered the critical section and now there can be context switch. So there is a context switch. P1 has not finished execution of critical section and there is a context switch. That means P2 will now execute. P2 will also enter this line and P2 will also execute the same test and set instruction. Now please tell me what is the test and set instruction for P2? What will this line return for P2?
1.
1. Because it has already been set to 1. Right? Now that this will return 1, this while condition will be true. If this while condition is true, that means you say that there is nothing to do, no operation. That means P2 will loop here. Okay. So P2 will keep on looping. P2 will not proceed from this. That's what we want. We don't want P2 to enter critical section. So now when P1 is again, now that again there's a context switch and you start with P1. Now that you come back to P1, P1 will complete the critical section execution and will reach to this line. When P1 will reach to this line, what will P1 do? P1 will turn lock back to 0. Okay, that is, it will unlock. And then it will complete the other code. In the meantime, if there's a context switch, then P2, which was looping here, now if it runs test and set, what will it get? Now P2, which was running, what will the return value of test and set be for P2?
0.
0, because it has been set to 0 by P1 before it came out, but just after it came out of the critical section. So now P2 will enter. And when P2 will enter, that will make lock equal to 1. Right? So that any other process cannot enter the critical section. So see, this is what has been written here. If the test and set instruction is executed simultaneously on two processors, then the hardware ensures that one test set read cell updates it to 1 and returns its previous value before the other gets executed. The first invocation will read a 0, set the lock to 1 and return. The second invocation will then see the lock equal to 1 and will loop continuously until the lock becomes 0. This is what and how we make use of the test and set instruction to ensure lock. Is that clear to everyone? How
Sir,
by
can we make any instruction atomic?
This has to be provided by the hardware vendor. As a user, you cannot. I'm just coming to that. As an example, let me give you the example of a test and set instruction that is provided by Intel. And as you see, Intel allows implementation of test and set by using an instruction called exchange, XCHG. That's a very, analogous to the swap function that we do. What we do in a swap, let's say there are two variables, two locations X and Y. You may have written this code in your programming classes where if you provide two locations X and Y, their contents get swapped after you run this. It's pretty similar. So one you will take 1, 0, and the other one will take, so suppose there are two lock and a variable called which is with 0 and 1, and you swap them so they get interchanged. So it makes use of this instruction. Let's have a look at this. What do you provide as an argument to this exchange? You provide an address and the value. And what happens is You take the value and put it in some register, EAX, the name of which, and then you exchange the contents of this address with the address of EAX. That's what you do. So the content of address goes into EAX and the contents of EAX goes into address. EAX in this case is the temporary variable or the temporary register that you are using to change the values. Let's look at this. Let's see the usage of exchange. This is the exit section or acquiring the log, and this is the entry section, acquiring the log, and this part is the exit section, which is releasing the log. Let's look at the entry section first. What does exchange do? Okay, what is the role of exchange? So what we provide to acquire is we give an integer called a pointer called log, so reference to a particular location. And what happens is it runs the exchange instruction where locked is the address, the memory location, and the value. So I plan to write the location locked with a value of 1. So I apply the exchange operation and give the arguments locked, 1. So if I use this according to this functionality, what happens? Locked is written to 1 and it returns the initial value. So if the initial value of lock was 0, okay, if this is 0, you break, means you come out of that. So constantly you get loop in that. Okay, so this is our typical usage. So that's test and set. The idea is you read a previous value and you write it with 1. So if the lock is 0, you read the lock and you update it with 1. So that any other process, when it tries to enter critical section, will see that the lock is 1 and will get stuck. Now, different vendors provide test and set operation by different instructions. Intel provides it through this instruction called XCHG. And obviously, the exit section is where you make the lock or you turn the lock back to 0. This is the typical usage or the way to implement test and set. Okay, here it is. So the idea is that one process will be acquiring the lock and the other will be waiting in loop until the lock is released by the first. This is the concept of mutual exclusion. One process gets the lock, the other will wait until the lock is released. How have you done that? This is the way. One process, the blue one, is acquiring the lock, so the process 2 gets stuck, and process 2 acquires the lock, process 1 gets stuck. Now this way of locking is called spin lock. Why it is called spin lock? It's called spin lock because the process which gets locked spins on that. That is, it loops. That is why it's called spin lock. Fine, it's a good idea. So let me give you a typical, implementation of spin locks in XV6. So as you see here, this is the spin lock definition, which is declared as a structure, and what we do is we utilize this spin lock. So this keeps the state of the lock. So spin lock is defined as a structure, and I'm mentioning the contents of spinlocks.h file from your XV6 board. So this is the header file that we are going to use. Spin lock is defined as the state, the name of the lock, the CPU that is currently holding the lock if there are more than one CPUs, and the call stack. So this is the elements of this particular spin lock. Okay. Now, how is this spin lock made use of in XV6? There's a file called spinlock.c. This is where the spin lock is used. I'm going to show you not the entire code, but only the relevant portions, which is the acquire, that is the lock section, and the unlock section. So this is the initialization of the lock. You initialize the lock with some name. you initialize the value that is the lock state of that particular lock with 0, and you initialize the CPU which is holding the lock with the number. So this is the function that initializes the structure, the elements of the structure. These are the files that we are going to include if you are planning to work with lock. And here you see we have included this spinlog.h where we had defined the structure of that particular spin. Now what happens? Let's look at the acquisition. You're acquiring the lock. What is it? As you see, absolutely the same concept that we have just discussed. So if you are holding the lock, then that means that you already have that. No need to do anything. This is the instruction that you are making use of. So XV6 is making use of this exchange instruction provided by Intel, assuming that XV6 is running on an Intel processor. So it's getting the exchange value. So it's passing on the value of lock and updating lock with 1. And then the return value of this exchange is checked with whether this is equal to 0. Okay. If you find that this is equal to 0, which means you have to loop. But if it is not equal to 0, then you enter and you start executing. This is the way in which the spin lock is executed in XV6. Have a look at that. Go to the XV6 folder and you will find this particular file and see how this is implemented. Okay. This is the release section of the lock. The interesting thing is, the only thing that we are going to do is just make the value of the lock equal to 0. So you are going to release that and return the value of the lock equal to 0. So this is no checking required here, just updating the value to 0. Okay. Now the pthreads library, if you remember when we were working with threads, we had used this pthread library. It gives us some APIs to work with threads. Pthread create, pthread join. Now this pthread library also gives us some APIs to work with locks, and they are all spin locks. Here you see this line. This is the line that we are talking about. So we are taking a pthread underscore spin underscore lock, and we are passing the lock, which is SPLK in this case. So we have declared SPLK as a lock of type pthread underscore spin lock underscore T. That's again defined in pthread.h. So this is the lock that is acquired. And this is the unlock section. So this is lock and this is unlock. So before we could work with this shared variable global counter. So global counter is, as you see, an integer that has been defined here. And assuming that that's the critical section. So it has to be guarded. So the lock and unlock should come before and after this count. Okay, this is how you're going to use. And this is the pthread spin lock function. In main, you make use of this pthread spin init to create the spin lock, and pthread spin destroy to destroy the spin. Okay. So these are the two spin locks that you can create, and you can make use of them to guard your critical section. So just see how this has been used. Before the thread 1 and 2 are created, a spin lock is created in the main function. Then once pthreads are created, the threads are created, whenever the thread 1 or 2 will be executed, they will eventually run this thread function. And within the thread function itself, you have guarded this counter updation part by the lock and unlock. So you are ensuring that mutual exclusion is not violated. Is it okay so far? Students, are you able to get it? The concept of lock and unlock?
Sir, what
Any
does the line
questions?
p3 spin init do?
Create. It's creating the spin lock. You will create a spin lock. You will create a lock. That's it. And that lock has been defined in the thread function. How has that been defined? Well, you will create the lock here, and they will make use of the lock in this thread function by using this pthread spin lock and pthread spin unlock. Okay, so there are 4 APIs: pthread spin init to create a lock, pthread spin lock to make use of that lock on a variable, pthread spin unlock to unlock that particular variable, and pthread spin destroy to destroy that. So these are the 4 APIs that are used to work with the locks. Okay. Obviously, in addition, the create and the join are there for things. Okay. But the spin locks are a problem. Why? There are a few issues with spin lock. Number one, no compiler optimization should be allowed. We often have different kind of optimizations during compile time. Okay, optimizations such as you want your code to run faster. Now there are a lot of optimizations that have been designed and they are available within compilers. So during compilation, the compiler tries to the code can be made faster. How? Suppose there is some memory access that has to be made. Sometimes the memory access is, instead of doing a memory access, that is written in the form of a register access. Why? Because registers are inside CPU, so accessing registers is faster than accessing memory. The compiler does that, and this is how things become faster. But here, if you are using spin locks, you cannot use any compiler optimization. For example, you cannot make X a register variable. You have to, if you're talking about that it is a memory location, it has to be a memory location. You cannot make it a register variable. Okay. Second is, you should not reorder the memory loads and the stores. You have to use a serialized instruction. The way in which things are coming, you have to follow that. Out of order execution is not allowed. That's a problem, right? We may require these things to make things faster or to optimize something else. These are not allowed. But these are all not a so severe problem. The most severe problem that we have for spin lock is called busy waiting. What is busy waiting? Busy waiting is seen if one process is currently executing the critical section and the other process is getting locked. What is the other process doing? The one which is getting locked. What is happening to that process? Think about a situation. This is the CPU. These are the two processes P1 and P2. And you want them to run in this way: P1, P2, P1, P2, P1, P2. You want them to be executed by the scheduler in this way. But what happens is, suppose P1 goes into a critical section and P1 is taking long. P2 also, when it gets its turn to execute, also wants to enter critical section, but it cannot, so it gets blocked. And it remains blocked, right? Because it gets blocked, there is nothing happening in the CPU. The CPU is not executing any instruction because it is not progressing. It's getting locked. But you have followed a round robin schedule. And let's say you have allowed the delta T time to this particular P2. So even if P2 is not doing anything or CPU is not executing any instruction of P2, you are spending some CPU cycles because this amount of time you have decided, or the scheduler has decided, that I will give to P2, whatever it may be. So P2 is unnecessarily remaining blocked, doing nothing, but simply the cycles are passing. So delta amount of time is unnecessarily passed, even if P2 is not doing anything. Similarly, again, you come to P1, again P1 is doing something in the CS, and again there's a context switch, again you come back to P2. P2 is still blocked, but this amount of time you have devoted, so it will be passing. This is called busy waiting, right? This is called busy waiting. You are doing nothing and spending CPU cycles. Now, these are very useful if you have a short critical section. That is, as the example that I have cited here. P1 completed the critical section very quickly, or maybe even if it did not complete, you gave P2 a chance, but next time when P1 gets its schedule, P1 completes it. If it is that kind of a stuff, it is fine. You keep P2 blocked for certain amount of time, one block, but next time when it gets, it's through, it's into the critical section. But if it is a short critical section, it is okay. But where the critical section is large, that is the P1 itself is taking a lot of time, you will have number of context switch, and every context switch will keep requiring the lock, getting blocked, and sending cycles. So this is the CPU time is wasted. Okay? CPU time is wasted. This is the problem. For example, to increment a counter, to access an array element. Now these are very time-taking critical sections. Suppose the array is a shared array, and let's say it's maybe 1,000 locations. So the process will take some time to update that, do some operation on the array. That's a time-taking critical section. In the meantime, if there is any other process, the process will be blocked and will spend some cycles. This is not good. So array is short critical time, just implementing one single counter, that's fine. That's a short critical section. But let's talk about a situation where, let's say, you are reading a page from the disk. It's a very long process. Okay. This is the first problem that you have on spin locks. But this problem eventually can lead to another very interesting problem, and this is called the problem of priority inversion. What is this priority inversion? If you remember, I already have introduced you to this problem. I'll still repeat that once again. So the problem is, now this busy waiting causes priority inversion. What is the problem? The problem is this. Suppose there are two processes, P1 and P2, and P1 is having a lower priority than P2. So this is a low priority. I hope all of you remember that we assign priorities to processes, and according to the priority, we decide on the schedule. Who will be given a chance if there is a requirement from both? How will the scheduler decide? So if both processes P1 and P2 are in the ready queue, because P1 is of a lower priority than P2, the scheduler will always give P2 a preference. P2 will always execute. That is about the scheduling criteria. So this means the scheduler gives P2 a chance to execute ahead of P1. So if both are in the ready queue, P1 and P2 both are in the ready queue. Okay, P1 and P2 both are in the ready queue. The scheduler will always give P2 a chance. This is what we design. Now, let us for the time being look at this situation. Suppose P1 is in the ready queue. There is no P2. Only in the ready queue P1 is there. So P1 gets a chance to execute. Okay. And both P1 and P2 are sharing a critical section. Okay. They are sharing some variable, some data structure. So there's a critical section. So P1 executes. It reaches the acquire lock portion. It acquires the lock, enters the critical section, did not come out of the critical section, and suddenly there is a context switch. There's a context switch. This is what happened. It went into this, and there is a, so this is a critical section. Let me put it as critical section. And suddenly there is a context switch. That means Now P2 has entered. Okay, so P2 is now there, and P1, P2 both. P1 was already running, entered the critical section, acquires the lock, did not come out of the critical section. So its job of critical section is not over. Suddenly a new process called P2 has arrived in the ready queue. P2 has arrived in the ready queue. The scheduler sees P2 is having a higher priority than P1 and allows P2 to proceed. So P2 starts execute. P2 starts execute. Okay. P2 reaches the entry section of the entry point of the critical section. It also wants to enter critical section. But because the lock is held by P1, it will not be allowed to enter critical section. So it will spin lock. It will constantly loop in the entry point of the critical section. Okay. Now see the problem. Process P2 wants to enter critical section, but for that it has to get the lock. But to get the lock, P1 has to release the lock. But for P1 to release the lock, P1 has to get a chance to execute on the CPU. But P1 will not be able to execute on the CPU because P1 is of a lower priority. Look at the problem. I repeat, P2 has reached the entry point of the critical section, but it cannot enter the critical section because it does not have the lock. So P2 should get the lock. But P2 will get the lock only when P1 releases that. But P1 has not released the lock. Why? Because P1 has not finished the critical section. But you may wonder, why doesn't P1 get a chance to release the lock? P1 will not get a chance to release the lock because P1 is not able to execute. Why P1 is not able to execute? P1 is not able to execute because P1 is of a low priority job. And the scheduler has said that I will always give a chance to P2. Because P2 is higher priority. Until P2 finishes, I will not give a chance to P1. And look at the situation. This is called a deadlock situation, where I want something from you and you are held back by, by some reasons. Okay. That's it. Or in other words, you can say that a high priority job called P2 is actually prevented from progressing by a low priority job P1. It is as if though P1 is having a low priority than P2, but it is as if the priorities have reversed. That is why it is called priority inversion. As if P1 now has become a higher priority task or a job and P2 is a lower priority job. Interesting. And this is creating trouble. Okay. So this is one of the articles that I want all of you to go through. It's the Mars Pathfinder problem. And let me give you the brief about that. You can just, for details, please have a look at this URL. Now, the project was to capture images from Mars. And for that was sent a rover, the Mars rover. Now, the operating system that was handling all such stuff was VxWorks. It's a real-time operating system based on Linux. So what it does is that manages all the tasks to be done by that particular rover, that robot. What was the task? The task was like moving in a particular path. The path was directed that you move in this particular line. Then there was a camera has to come out. It has to take the pictures and send the pictures back to the base station, the NASA base station. These were different tasks which were there. So consider them to be different threads. Okay. Now, VxWorks is the manager. This operating system is the one that handles all these threads. Now, the question is, one of the thread, it's a low priority thread, was holding a lock. And then because it's a scheduler is running, the scheduler switched on to a high priority process. And that high priority process never got that lock back because, or did not get that lock back because it was held by a low priority process which was never getting a chance to execute. And because it is a real-time operating system, it will see that if there is any process which is not progressing, it will reboot itself. So the problem that was happening is scientists were finding that this particular robot is rebooting after every few minutes. Why is it happening? It did not understand. So it was constantly rebooting. Whenever this priority inversion was happening and that particular high priority task was not able to move forward, the entire system shut down and it was rebooted. It was going on in this way. And this was the problem. There was a priority inversion that happened. And the project failed. So what is the solution to this problem? The solution is that the process which currently is not having a priority, okay, you inherit that particular priority. Okay, so you have to inherit that. This is the priority solution. That is, for the time being, the low priority process which the scheduler is not allowing to progress, and that is the reason why it is not completing its critical section. For the time being, elevate its priority, elevate the priority of P1 so that it can complete its critical section, complete the execution, and release the log. This is called priority inheritance. What is inheritance? You inherit the priority. Whose priority? Well, the person who is restricting you. You inherit the priority of that. Inherit the priority. P1 will inherit the priority of P2, elevate itself in priority, get a chance to execute. The moment it executes, it completes the critical section and releases the log. This is the solution. The solution to priority inversion is priority inheritance. As you see, it's because it's a consequence of busy waiting. So what is to be done? Okay. One solution of busy waiting is if we can put the critical section. So instead of busy wait, what is busy waiting? It was like the CPU cycles were running and this cycle, the CPU was moving into it was unnecessarily looping. Now, the other possibility is that instead of allowing that particular process to constantly loop, can you put it to sleep? Okay, can you put it to sleep? And when you will give it a chance, wake up. Let's see this. This is the exchange or the lock. So the exchange instruction will be used for locking. And let's have a look at that. So we introduced this part. Previously, we were just happy with this. Now we have introduced this part. It means that if there is some process that gets locked here in this line, okay, that means it finds that the lock is equal to 1. What will it do? It will be put to sleep, right? It will not loop. It will be put to sleep. It is as if, I am constantly checking whether I will get a chance or not. Looping it was like this, busy looping. But I will always, whenever I will be given a chance to get executed, I will execute till this particular point, and I will check whether now I have my value set, which should allow me to enter critical section. But sleep means you don't care about that. When you will be given a chance, then you will get up and then enter. Okay, this is the idea. Okay, so these kind of locks which allow a particular process to be put to sleep if it does not get a chance to enter critical section is called mutex. We will call them as mutex. Okay. Now different books use mutex similar to semaphores, but for the time being we are not going to do that. We will call those spin locks. They are a kind of spin lock, but the locks which will be if a particular process is goes into a lock, or if it loops in a lock, instead of busy looping, it will be put to sleep. That's the difference with spin locks. Clear? Okay. Now, during the unlock, so let's see. So if this is the unlock stage, when you have an unlock, you make the process which was currently executing now has an additional responsibility. Now go back to the previous spin lock case. When there was a spin lock, the process which was executing in the critical section, when it came out of the critical section, its only job is to unlock. It's like this. There are a number of patients who are waiting outside the operation theater, and there is one patient who's currently being served inside the OT. The lock is like this, that you turn on the bulb. When the operation is on, you turn on the bulb so that any new patient who's going to come will see the lock and say, oh, there's something which is going on. The OT is already engaged. I should wait. But that person falls asleep because the operation is taking too long. The patient who's currently in the OT, the operation is taking too long, and that patient fell asleep. Okay. Now, when the operation is over, there are two things to do. Number one, turn off that light. It is an indication that the operation is over. Now somebody else can be given a chance. And the second thing to do is wake him up that, hey, the operation is over. Now you can get a chance. Right? So this is the second thing to do. That is why it's called the wake up. Now there's an additional responsibility of the process which is currently in the critical section. Not only to signal that I am done, not only to make the log back to 0, also to wake up other processes. This is the additional responsibility of the mutex during unlock. pthread gives you a few functions: pthread mutex lock and pthread mutex unlock, very similar to how we saw spin locks. Mutex is also there for okay. This is the solution. Seems to be a good solution, that I don't want to be kept in busy waiting. Rather, I put to sleep so I don't waste CPU cycles. But is it a good solution? Does it work? Let's see. Okay, it does not work. Why? Because there may be a large number of processes which have been woken up. And it's called thundering hard problem. You know what? Suppose the operation is over and the doctor has asked the attendant to go and turn off the light and wake up all the patients who are waiting outside. Now the attendant, he comes out with a mic and shouts loudly. So what happens is a lot of people get woken up. Now the question is, had you woken up only one person out of all the waiting patients, it would have been easier, because that person who got woken up would have been allowed next into the operation theater. But now you go back to the same problem. You have woken up many people. Many people were waiting for that OT, and many have woken up. It's like thundering hard problem. The sheep, all of them were sleeping, and suddenly there's thunder and all of them wakes up. When all of them wake up, there can be several context switch. Means who will get a chance? Because all of them now are ready. And sometimes P1, P2, P3, all of them now want to go into the operation theater. Now, this particular thing can lead to starvation. Starvation means let's say the person who speaks loudly or who can, bully kind of, he goes into the operation theater. And the person who's a very quiet person, he just talks less, he may not get a chance to enter the OT. And every time this thing happens, he never gets a chance. There is somebody else who bullies him and goes into the OT and does his job. So what will happen to the person who's very quiet? He will starve. He will never get a chance to enter the OT. because every time there is some new person who has come in, everybody falls asleep, attendant comes outside, shouts loudly, a lot of people get woken up, and the bully goes inside the operation theater and he gets operated. And the person who's quiet never gets a chance. Now that's the problem. This is a typical case of starvation. Okay. So the idea is we cannot allow all of them to wake up at the same time. We will allow only one process to be woken up. Okay. So what we are going to do is, how do you ensure that? Well, let me again go back to that analogy of this operation theater. The idea is that whenever a person came and he fell asleep, you keep track of who came when. You give a token. So think it in terms of a queue. You maintain a queue. Okay, this person came first and he was sleeping. So when if many people have woken up, no problem. The person who came earlier was first put to sleep. So you'll be the one who should be allowed to enter. So what you do is, when you put processes to sleep, you just not only put them to sleep, but you maintain them in a proper data structure, which in this case is a queue. So when processes go to sleep, they are actually pushed into a queue before they are blocked. Okay? And when you exit the process, one process which was executing in the critical section, when it comes out of the critical section, it's the responsibility of that process to wake up the first process in the queue. Please understand this. So the process which will come out of the critical section will wake up the person who is at the head of the queue. Only one to head of the queue. Clear? This is the idea. Let's have a look at the implementation. This is the definition of the lock, which reads the previous value and returns the previous value and updates the new value. Now this is the process, and here we check the status of the lock. If the lock is 1, you get locked here. Let us assume that there is a process called P1, which is currently in the critical section. P1 is in CS and P2 gets locked. But it is not mere locking. First, it is added to the queue. So you maintain a queue of all locked processes. And you first put P2. P1 is still in the critical section. Now, in the meantime, there's a process called P3 which has come. P3 also executes this line and gets locked. Because P1 is in the critical section, P1 has not come out. So P3 will also be put into the queue. Then there is P4, P5, all of them have come and they are all put into this sleep queue, one by one. So what you do, you add it to the queue and you put them to sleep. So all of them are sleeping. Okay, all of them are sleeping. The moment a process comes, it gets scheduled, reaches this line, finds lock is not there, is put to sleep. Now, let's look at what happens to P1. P1 now is done with the critical section. P1 proceeds and comes in the exit section of the code. P1 now is in the exit section. What should P1 do? P1 should first of all make the lock equal to 0. Analogous to turning off the bulb. Makes it. And then it removes the process P from the queue. Which process? This fellow. The one which is at the head of the queue. So it's the responsibility of P1 to wake up this particular process. So it sends a signal called wake up. So this wake up is actually meant for process P2, which is sleeping. Is that clear, everyone? So P1 has 2 roles to play. First of all, turning off the lock. Number 2, sending a wake up for the processes which are sleeping. in this case, the process which is at the head of the queue, which is P2, it should send this. So the problem is solved. Lock ensures mutual exclusion. Wake up ensures that one of them will be given a chance, which is at the head of the queue, so no starvation. Fair enough solution. What do you think? Does it work?
No, sir.
Does it work?
No, sir. Sir,
yes. How many of you say does it work? It should work. Good solution.
No, sir, it won't work, sir.
Why?
Because, sir, in the unlock section, there are, when we would do logged is equal to 0, then maybe another process would be trying to, it would come to exchange logged 1. And P6 would see that, for example, P6 comes and it sees the log exchange logged is equal to 0, and P6 then comes into the critical section, and P2 and the P1 process then wakes up the P2 and it still sees logged is equal to 0.
Mutual exclusion is preserved. There's nothing, no doubt about mutual exclusion. It's not that lock will be, the value of lock will be same for two processes. This cannot happen. This will never happen. Because whoever has made lock equal to 0 now will allow other processes to compete for the lock, and one of them will get it. That's not a problem. Mutual exclusion is guaranteed because exchange, whoever executes this line, whichever process will execute this line will get the lock. That's for sure. No problem with mutual exclusion. My problem is with the wake up. Will that happen in that order? Let's see. Let's see this problem to understand this. This producer consumer problem, because this is the problem that will give us an idea that the solution that we have just discussed need not be correct. I hope all of you remember the producer consumer problem. The problem is that there is a producer process that produces items, and there's a consumer process that consumes those items. The producer produces them and puts it in a buffer. The consumer consumes them from the buffer. If the buffer is of infinite size, which is called unbounded, so there is no problem if process consumer and the producer have different rate. There is no problem. The problem is if the producer and the consumer have different rate and the buffer is bounded, that is of a limited size, as in this case. Why? Because there can be two possibilities, as you see in this case. If it is a bounded buffer, then as two processes are sharing the buffer, which is nothing but a memory location, certain size, the buffer has a finite size, that is, it is bounded. The problem is that the producer will write to the buffer, consumer will read it. The full buffer, if the producer is producing items very fast and consumer is not able to consume them, then the producer will very soon fill up the entire buffer. And if the buffer becomes full, there is no place for additional items. So the producer stops. That is why it says a full buffer stops the producer. Now think about the other case. The consumer is consuming things very fast, and the producer is not producing items at that rate. So very soon you will see that the buffer will be empty because the consumer has consumed all items that the producer has produced. There is no more item to consume. So an empty buffer will stop the consumer. Now this stop producer, stop consumer is nothing but putting them to sleep. That's what we are going to do. Let's see. Let's look at the code. And here we have the code. We are planning to solve this problem through mutex. Spin locks with sleep. Let's take a buffer of size n. Let's take a count 0. And let us take 3 mutex. One is something called mutex. So this is the type, and these are the variables: mutex, empty, and full. So we are taking 3 mutex. Okay, let's look at the producer code. And this is the consumer code. The producer code, what is the producer going to do? Producer is going to produce the item. So let us assume that produce underscore item is the function that produces item. And I should have declared here something called int item. Let me declare int item. And so produce item is there and stored it in int. Now, what is the producer going to do? We just saw that a full buffer stops producer. So what is the producer supposed to check? Whether the buffer is full or not. What will the check be? To check whether the value of count is the number of items that have been currently been put in that particular buffer. If the count has reached n, that means the buffer is full, right? Okay. So what you do is, if the count is n, you sleep. Okay, you sleep. Sleep on what? Sleep on this particular mutex empty. You sleep on the mutex empty until, what does this mean? It means you sleep, the producer will be put to sleep and will be waiting on this particular variable called empty. It will be woken up based on the status of this particular variable empty. Until the status of empty is changed, producer will not be produced. Producer will not be updated. Okay, so the producer is supposed to check the value of the count, and if it finds it's equal to n, then it is put to sleep, and it will be woken up only on if the status of empty is changed. Okay, so this is the first job that the producer should do. Next, let us assume, let's start with the situation where for the time being, let's say that buffer is entirely empty and there is an item which has been produced. So the item will be produced. Count is equal to n. No, count is not equal to n. Count is equal to 1. Or not necessarily. Count is currently 0, so it enters. And now this item has to be inserted. Well, because you are touching the buffer, so this buffer has to be protected, isn't it? There has to be a lock. So that is the reason why this lock is used. And here we are using this variable called mutex. Okay, lock means any process that you can think of. So for the time being, let us assume that we are using an exchange instruction. So if you are using an exchange instruction and the mutex was initially equal to 0, so you will fall through this particular. So let's assume that you are making use of this xchg and you are taking 1 0. So what will happen? Mutex is initially, let's say, 0. So you will enter this, you will fall through this loop and you will make mutex equal to 1 so that no other process, that is the consumer process, is not allowed to touch this buffer. So the producer will enter this line and will insert the item into the buffer. Clear? Agreed, all of you? I repeat, the producer will produce the item, put it in a variable called item, will check whether the count has become n. If the count is n, it will put to sleep, woken up on the status of the empty mutex. Then it's time for, let us assume that we started off with n value equal to 0. The buffer is n, so the count value equal to 0. So you entered this, use mutex, locked it, and entered the buffer to put that item. Now these are the two critical sections. One is the data structure buffer, where you are performing some write operation, and second is the count variable, because both buffer and count are shared. So all those places where count and buffer exist, there you have to use a lock. So that is the reason why we are using this lock unlock with this mutex to ensure that the buffer and the count are protected. When the producer is touching them, consumer should not touch them. When the consumer is touching them, the producer should not touch them. So let us assume that you are the producer and you have inserted your first item. count becomes 1. Okay, it's unlock. So mutex is unlock. You reach to this next line, which is this if condition. And here you have count equal to 1. And you have sent a wake up. You check whether count was equal to 1. Yes, count has become 1 because you have inserted an item and you have made count equal to 1. And here you have used if count equal to 1, you send a wake up signal. Wake up signal for what? For full. What did you assume? You assume that as if the consumer was sleeping. You assume that the consumer was sleeping and you sent a wake up. But the problem is, just let me show you this condition. This is the problem that will happen. So for the timing, let's just look at the situation. This is the producer code. Let's look at the consumer code. What is the consumer supposed to do? The consumer is supposed to check whether the count is equal to 0. Remember, if full buffer stops producer, the empty buffer stops consumer. So we are going to see whether the count has become 0 or not. If the count is 0, you will put the consumer to sleep and it will wake up on the status of the full. Okay. Then again, if it is consumer, it is going to remove some item. So remove item means again you are touching the buffer. So it has to be locked. So you will have a lock unlock. So you will touch the buffer, that is, you will remove the item from there. Remove the item and put it in the variable called item and decrement the count. So both count and the buffer are critical section. This is the CS. Okay. This is the CS. That's protected by the mutex. Then the responsibility of the producer is to wake up the producer if it is sleeping. If the responsibility of the producer is to wake up the consumer which is sleeping, it is the responsibility of the consumer to wake up the producer if it is sleeping. It is like this. Both of them have, in addition to lock and unlock, have two roles to play. Producer will wake up the sleeping consumer and the consumer will be waking up the sleeping producer. When will it wake up? It will find that if count is equal to n-1, it will wake up. What does this mean? It means that when consumer completes the critical section and comes out, it finds out, is there anyone who is sleeping? Is there any producer who is sleeping? How to test that? It will test whether count is equal to n-1. Okay. If it is going to test the count current value n-1, it will know that at least there is somebody who's sleeping, so I should send a wake up. That same thing happened with producer. Producer thought that if any consumer is sleeping, the count should have become 1, so let me send a wake up. Both did their job and it was perfect. But they did not take into account this problem. Let's look at this. So the consumer, let us assume, has read the count value and the count value was equal to 0. Okay, initially started off with count equal to 0. Then there was a context switch. We went into the producer code. The producer also read the count, but first it produced the item. Okay, so it produced the item. Then it locked itself, no problem with that. Inserted the item into the buffer, still no problem. Here the count was made 1. So the producer produced his first item, makes the count equal to 1, unlocks itself. So now somebody else can touch the critical section. And then it tests whether count is equal to 1. When it comes out, there's an if condition. If count equal to 1, it sends a wake up. Wake up or signal, whatever it is. Okay. Now the problem is that the consumer was not sleeping. So the consumer is not sleeping. If the consumer is not sleeping, the wake up which is sent by the producer is an unnecessary wake up. It's a redundant. So there is no reason for that. So what happens? The consumer ignores it because it is not sleeping. So what happens? There's again a context switch, and the consumer starts executing and finds that I have to read the value of count. It reads the value of count. It reads the value of count. Let's go back here. It reads the value of count and finds the count equal to 0 and is put to sleep. Look at the problem. This is where things go wrong. The count has actually become 1 because it has been made 1 by producer, and producer has done correctly because it has made 1. It is sending a wake up saying that, okay, if you are sleeping, you will get woken up. But it does not happen because this value has already been read before the condition is checked. And the condition, the value read is 0. So now when this line is executed by the consumer, it will find count equal to 0 and it will be put to sleep. So the consumer sleeps. Okay, consumer sleeps. Because consumer sleeps, the control comes back to producer. Producer starts its process. Are you able to see this? Class?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So if the producer now, so what did we say? The consumer sleeps, right? The consumer sleeps and the control comes back to the producer. When the control comes back to the producer, again, the producer will produce the next item. It will again check whether the count is equal to n or not. Is the count equal to n? No. So it will sleep. Sorry. If count is not equal to n, it will proceed. It will insert the item, make the count equal to 2, unlock. If count equal to 1, no, there's nothing to be sent. It is already sleeping. Again, because the count has moved to 2, so this condition will never be executed. This line will never be executed. Again, the producer will produce this item. Again, we'll check whether it is equal to n. Again, to lock, and this process will go on till the time when count becomes equal to n. When count becomes equal to n, the producer process will be put to sleep. And now you see the situation. The consumer is already sleeping. The producer is also put to sleep. See, what is the problem? The problem is both the process now is put to sleep. So who will wake up whom? Let's understand the situation again. The producer created the first item, incremented the count by 1, sent a wake up, but this wake up was not necessary because the consumer was already sleeping, or was not sleeping. Consumer had already read that value of count. There was a context switch happened. When it checked, it found that the count is 0. So it was put to sleep. The consumer immediately was put to sleep. Because the consumer was sleeping, the control came back to the producer. Producer kept on generating items and started incrementing the count. Finally, when the count reached n, nobody is consuming that because the consumer is sleeping. So the producer is keeping on generating items. It's generating items and putting them in the buffer. Finally, when n items are generated, the entire buffer is full. When the entire buffer is full, this condition will put the producer also to sleep. Now you have a situation where both producer and consumer is sleeping. And this is the deadlock situation. So So the wake up which was sent by the producer is lost. Consumer was put to sleep, and eventually producer was also put to sleep after it created n items. So eventually both producer and consumer, they wait infinitely. This is the problem that we have with the producer, the problem that we have if we try to use mutex to solve the producer consumer problem. So today I stop it here, and I gave you the basic idea of lock, unlock, and how these spin locks and mutex can be used to solve the critical section problem. But we also saw that there can be a lot of processes which will be waiting on a particular lock. So how to handle that problem? How to keep track of which particular process is sleeping and how to ensure their ordering. This is the problem that still remains with mutex and spin locks. Spin locks have the problem of busy waiting, and mutex, as you see, have the problem of handling a number of processes which are put to sleep, to wake up. So tomorrow we are going to see how this problem can be overcome by introducing a concept called semaphores, which will take into account both lock as well as ordering of the sleeping processes. Okay. So tomorrow I'll be continuing with this lecture.